hybrid tea rose. A lonely seed settled in the soil of a strange land. It was a place its sire didn't live in and had never been to. The seed had been taken from its home and its family by travelling birds, a home that was now far away. Now it lived in foreign wet soil, and it had no way of going back home. The seed was sad and lay alone in the soil's darkness for some time, missing its sire and its home. Some plant roots that lived down below it heard it crying and travelled upward to see it. "Why do you cry so often?" they asked.
"I miss my sire,"
said the seed tearfully.
"And I don't know this place."
"This is a nice place," the roots replied. "We're taken care of here. We're fed well, watered well, and all creatures come to admire us. Come up to the surface and see." But the sad seed remained in the soil. It was too sorrowful. Every now and then the watchful roots spoke to it with encouraging words. They didn't know who the seed's family were, but they believed they could help to nurture it so that it wouldn't be sad anymore. So kind were their words that the seed, despite its fear, pushed out tiny green roots into the dirt, to the applause of its surrounding friends. "Come up, cried the roots. "It's lovely above the surface. Come up and see the vast open sky. Come and see the birds and butterflies." They coaxed the seedling with water from their own bodies. It drank from them gratefully. It also fed on nutrients in the soil. The seedling grew bigger and taller. Its roots gradually changed colour, deepening into a dark brown. As the roots around it fed and encouraged it, the little plant wasn't as afraid as it used to be. It listened quietly to so many wonderful tales told by the roots of life above the surface that it became very interested in seeing what life outside the soil was like. One day the head of its stem popped out of the ground, cautiously and fearfully. It was frightened by the lack of dirt and by the light and empty air. The roots had been telling the truth of all they had seen above the surface. The sky overhead was big and blue, and there were white, fat things called clouds that drifted in them so far away. Birds flew beneath the clouds on wings that made them move so fast. There were other creatures with wings, like butterflies and bees, and some came down to look at it. They asked it what kind of plant it was, and the plant, which was now a bud, told it that it didn't really know. Its sire would have known, but its sire was far away. The butterflies and bees told it must be a rose plant.
"After all,"
they said,
"all the other plants around you are roses, and you've been planted in a rose bush."
The bud saw that all of its friends who had encouraged it to grow were above the surface roses. They were stately where they stood. Long, graceful stems supported clusters of beautifully designed crowns made of petals of various colours. "Hello," said the bud's friends happily. "Welcome to the surface. Grow taller so that you can join us." But the bud was reluctant to join such beautiful things, and on days when it rained, the bud tried to go back into the ground. Its friends encouraged it to reach higher. "If you keep growing," they said, "you'll be just as beautiful and as tall as we are. You'll have vibrant green leaves and captivating thorns. Creatures will come a long way to see you."
"No, they won't,"
said the bud.
"Not when I look like everyone else."
"They will, because you're special. You're not like us, the grandiflora. You're something different. Now that you're older, we can tell that you're a hybrid tea rose. You're the most beautiful of all." The bud blushed. It wanted to be beautiful like its friends. it would take their advice and allow itself to grow. The grandiflora continuously fed it with water from their own roots to encourage it, and even used their roots to form fences around the bud so that it wouldn't be afraid to rise. The bud got wiser and taller, thriving in the sunlight, the air, and the promise that it would be the most special of them all. Over time it gained a bulbous head, and it grew larger from the praise and kindness that was showered on it by the neighbouring roses. The bulb opened and petals emerged, each carrying a beautiful red. It was indeed not a grandiflora like the others. It was a hybrid tea, like its sire. Animals and insects travelled to see the lovely rose. Its petals grew more scarlet by the day. It was happy because it was admired and loved by everyone, first for its beauty and later on for its charming demeanour that it had cultivated by copying the charm of its friends. The hybrid tea rose was regal among the others, and they liked that it was among them because its presence attracted a larger audience. In thanks, the other roses constantly fed it with water from their roots. Another type of rose had been growing beside it as well. It had grown at a similar time as the hybrid tea and flourished as a rosebush. These were the floribundas, and they liked the charming hybrid tea just as much as others did. They felt special when it turned its charm on them, and in thanks, they not only watered it like the grandifloras would, they also stretched their thorns across its stem to protect it from wandering herbivores. As time passed, the hybrid tea no longer cared to grow its own thorns. It didn't have to, because the floribunda had lent it their thorns for protection. Neither had its roots ever grown as long as they needed to for water and nutrients, because the grandifloras never ceased to water its roots for it. The base of its stem was guarded by common nettles, bashful plants to whom it said kind and flattering words every day. After a time, the rose felt that it could instruct the plants around it on how best to provide for and protect it. When the grandifloras admired its scarlet petals, the rose would say, "And my red petals would be darker and more beautiful still, as would my leaves, if you would only give my roots more water." "Then why not grow your roots?" asked some of the flowers. "That way you can have as much water from down below as you like."
"I can't stretch my roots any further," the rose argued. "They're stunted. And even if I try, my petals and leaves will weaken and pale, because all the water and food I've consumed will be diverted to my struggling roots."
When the floribundas sought to give it a compliment, the rose didn't accept it happily.
"Thank you for praising my lovely stem," it said, "but it won't be beautiful for long, because you refuse to extend your thorns further across so that I'm properly protected from all the curious and hungry creatures that try to pick at me. One day they will bite me, pull at me and break me in two."
The flowers felt guilty and did their best to serve the rose so that it would be happy again. But the rose was never happy. It became demanding and developed a sense of entitlement. It often chided the common nettles for not preventing every single predator that approached from snapping at its stem. It scolded the protective floribundas for having short thorns that were never as sharp as it wanted them to be. It eventually accused the grandifloras of being greedy and selfish, since they weren't giving it the amount of water that it needed to be the best version of itself. The rose had become mean. Its habit of berating its friends openly caused them to dislike it. The nettles, having the softest hearts, were ashamed because of the rose's constant complaints against them. They were no longer comfortable with sitting at the feet of the rose and began to distance themselves from it. One day the rose woke to the uncomfortable feeling of its stem being licked. It saw that hungry rabbits had leapt over the fence and into its garden. The rabbits, eyeing the rose, had thought that it would make a tasty meal. The rose was surprised, since its stem should have been protected by the common nettles that lived at its foot. but the common nettles were gone. They had all left to sit at the feet of other flowers. The base of the rose's stem was now open and vulnerable. The rose raised its voice and spoke badly of the common nettles to humiliate them. The floribundas, pitying the rose, worked hard to grow thorns low enough to protect the base of the rose's stem. But they struggled to achieve this, and the rose cursed them as well, while its stem was gnawed at constantly by rabbits. Eventually, the kind floribundas became resentful. After all, the rose should have been providing its own thorns. Why did they have to protect it?
"Grow your own thorns," they said angrily. "We can't stretch our own as far as we would like to help you." "You didn't teach me how to grow my thorns that low," the rose replied. "No one did. Now that I'm dependent on you to protect my stem, you refuse to do so. Many of you are of low character and selfish, because you complain now when I need you most."
Such cutting words upset the floribundas so much that they no longer cared to guard the rose. They withdrew all of their thorns, including the ones higher up that were protecting the rose properly. They turned their dark crowns away from the rose and cared to speak to it no more. After a time, the rose found that adventurous deer liked to hop the fence into its garden and search for unprotected flowers to eat. They now liked to bite on its stem and even stole some of its petals to eat. It was ashamed of its fading beauty and begged the grandifloras to give it more water so that it could replace its lost petals and leaves. The grandifloras pitied it, since they had known it since it was a little seed. They gave it as much of their water as they could afford, but their contributions always fell short because the soil didn't contain as much moisture as it used to. The days were hot and dry, and all the flowers were thirsty and hungry. The rose was irritable and often angry. It cursed the grandifloras for not giving it enough water, which was yet another problem to add to it being preyed upon by the animals and insects that kept invading the garden.
"The time has come for you to fend for yourself," said the grandifloras. "We are all hungry and thirsty. What we have isn't enough to feed you with." "You never taught me to fend for myself," argued the rose. "Instead, you gave me whatever I desired. How then can I survive without you helping me?"
"You can survive," they replied, "and you can learn to remove your ingratitude. We help out of kindness and not out of obligation."
"You speak as if I've become a burden," said the rose accusingly. "How difficult can it be to give me some of your water? You never taught me how to extend my roots far enough to find the water you've always been able to obtain. If I die from thirst, it'll be your fault."
"You have become a burden indeed," said the grandifloras. "We were kind to you, but we were too kind. We should have let you care for yourself. Instead, we did the work for you and never corrected you when you demanded special treatment from everyone. Now you must feed yourself. You must protect yourself."
"How selfish!"
The rose was furious. Night and day it cursed them. Sometimes the grandifloras responded out of guilt, since it blamed them for forcing it to come up onto the surface and into a life of hardship. Some of the grandifloras still tried to supply it with water, but there came a time when even they could do so no more. There came a time when even the grandifloras cared to listen to the rose no longer. One morning the rose woke suddenly to find that an animal had just violently ripped some of its petals from its head. It was a deer, a very bold one. It had seen that the rose was weak, alone, and possessed unnaturally small thorns with which to protect itself. The rose cried out for aid, but saw that the grandifloras had removed themselves from its side the night before. It now had no protection. The deer was joined by another. Their hard hooves trampled its stalk and pushed it closer to the ground. They ate all of its petals and leaves and chewed its stems. The rose was no more, and neither the grandifloras, the floribundas, nor the common nettles mourned it. Thank you for listening to the story of the hybrid tea rose. Come back for another story in the Plants series.